happy-go-lucky, carefree kid, just consumed with soccer and traveling with my family, to being ridiculed, embarrassed, ashamed, angry. And I grew up a pretty angry teenager. This happened when I was 11. So things pivoted immediately. I went from being a pretty confident kid to being remarkably introverted and almost socially awkward because I remember going to the school, and I hope they still communicate these things today in school. Uh, don't do drugs, so forth and so on. But I can remember sitting in PE class and looking to my left. I'll never forget this. They had news clippings and they would say, don't do drugs and things like that. And they actually had news articles about my dad, and they knew that I went to that school. It was so embarrassing. I remember tearing them down. And so I didn't want to look at anybody. I just kind of would wear my hat and I'd pull it down over my face. And eventually that converted to like just a rage, quiet rage. You didn't want to say anything to me. You didn't want to bump into me because it could just be one thing that would cause me to snap. We went from living in that affluent situation of my mom uh, basically working three jobs just to make ends meet. And I honor my mom for that. She's a remarkably strong woman. But at the same time, I grew up kind of bitter toward my mom because I felt like I was missing out on my teenage years. And I can remember, it may sound silly, but roller skating was the thing back in the day. And we would all go, we go to this place called Golden Skate Road on Friday night. And I can remember one night, I wanted to holler at this young lady, Monique Archer. And I was like, oh, tonight's the night. But I was so embarrassed because the only way I was going to go, I'll never forget this, is if I took my younger brother and sister, which just killed all any hopes of me having any game. And I remember it would just be little stuff like that that would just give me another reason to be angry and angry at everybody. And so I became a person that if you didn't know him in public, you didn't want to be around. But then it became apparent that this is who I was becoming at home. My family didn't want to be around me. I had shunned them and they knew it just took one thing to set me off. I literally gave my family Hades, just a very difficult time. So in all of this, as this is happening, my mom is working three jobs. I'm kind of raising my younger siblings and being bitter. I began to try things that were out of character for me. I played sports, and up until this point, sports was my saving grace. I had become injured and could no longer travel with the soccer team. And this was devastating to me because I was fortunate enough and good enough where the coaches would come and pick me up. And so I didn't have to worry about that. And other families would invest so that I could be a part of these select teams and play. But when I got injured, everything changed dramatically. I severely sprained my ankle and I had a lot of downtime. And so I met this young lady. And this young lady and I began to date in high school. And that relationship kind of became this all-consuming relationship. Nobody else in the world mattered. And let me just say this. Let me just pause here for just a second. I don't know. I just feel like I should share this. I'm down. Look, have your boo, have your bae. I get all that. But let me just say this. If your friendship or relationship, depending upon where it is, if it is all consuming and it separates you and isolates you from mom, dad, a good friend, or friends in general, or people that are part of the church, whatever the case may be, that is not a good relationship to be in. That's a red flag. That's what I found myself in. It was an all consuming relationship that wasn't very healthy. And as we began to date, our relationship became more and more intense, and the way that we began to express ourselves became more and more intense. And in doing so, we later found out shortly after our seeing one another and being in love with one another, or so we thought. About a year into it, we discovered that she was pregnant, and we did not know what to do. We were overwhelmed with anxiety. We were overwhelmed with the grief and the thought of being a parent when we ourselves were children and not knowing what to do. We knew we couldn't talk to our parents, or at least we felt like we couldn't talk to our parents. We had nobody else that we were comfortable sharing. And let me just say this too. Um, if you find yourself up against the wall and you feel like you maybe have no place to go to, don't believe that. You know what? We could have talked to our parents. We could have talked to my mom and my dad, and we could have talked to her parents, and they would have helped us through this. Instead, we decided to do what we thought would be the best thing, and we decided to terminate that pregnancy. And I'll never forget that day because we were so naive and not knowing what to do. We were so emotionally unintelligent and thought we were savvy enough to navigate to what we were doing that we had, out of our naivety and just teenage youthfulness, we thought we would go see a movie after she had this procedure done. And I remember saying, "Hey, I'm going to be with you every step of the way." Uh, and so we go down to this clinic, and I can remember the day so vividly. I can remember the sunshine, the way it was shining in, and us pulling into the clinic. I can remember people with signs outside, some yelling, screaming, some crying, saying, don't terminate this pregnancy. Think about what you're doing. Some people were yelling things not very pleasant at all, things that we didn't think that we were. And I can remember walking in to the clinic and looking and being the only guy there, and then looking at ladies, young and old. Some you could tell had been there perhaps more than once or just had a different degree of comfort. Others were scared out of their mind, shaking. I remember one young lady, she was just so stoic, but she was trembling, tears streaming down her face, snot, or the whole nine. And we were just, the gravity of the moment began to settle in as much as we could understand it. And I remember them calling her, she going back, and then what seemed like an eternity, probably more like a couple of hours, she comes out, and it was just, we were suffocated by this silence, not knowing what to do. Um, and I didn't know how to break the ice, the proverbial ice, so to speak. And I waited about 20, 25 minutes because it was just overwhelming, the silence that we felt. And I remember saying, we were getting close to the exit to where we lived, and the movie theater wasn't far from where we lived. I said, "Hey, do you still want to go see a movie?" And I can remember her looking at me so broken. And she said, "Do you really think I want to go see a movie after what I've been through?" And I didn't know how to respond to that. Of course, what 15-year-old would. Um, and so we went home, and that devastated the two of us. Emotionally, we didn't have the intelligence to deal with that, and things really kind of began to fall off the bus. We both began to do things that were remarkably uncharacteristic for the two of us. We were both two bright, intelligent kids, studying, doing very well academically. Our grades began to slip enormously. We began to isolate even more and begin to do things. I began to deal with such a grief because I would have a recurring nightmare. And this nightmare would be, and baseball at that time, it's not as popular now in the States, but at one point, baseball was everything. It wasn't at this time, but it was much more popular than it is now. I have this nightmare. Um, and the thing that made it a nightmare was because it was kind of like, it was almost deceitful in that I'd be at this baseball game and I would be with my son, and we'd be having the most amazing time. And it was just a great time. And it was kind of like one of those, the game was good. We're having the time of our life. It was like movie-esque like. And I can remember the seventh inning, there's something called the seventh inning stretch, if you're not familiar with baseball. And they sang this song, "Take me out to the ball game, take me out to the crowd," and we're all singing this, and we're having fun and popcorn, and he's sitting on my lap. And like right in the middle of this, my son looks at me and he says, "Dad, why did you kill me?" Uh, and I was so overwhelmed. I didn't know what to say. I'm trying to clutch him and hold on to him. And he would disappear in my arms. And I would just say, "Son, Daddy is so sorry. I didn't know what I was doing. Please, please, please forgive me." And he would disappear. And I would be haunted by this nightmare this recurring nightmare. And at this point, I would begin to try everything you can think of to deal with that pain and that hurt. If you want to talk about promiscuity, I tried it. I was a 15, 16-year-old kid at that point who had dealt with a lot of life. And so people thought I was a lot older than I actually was. And so I was able to get a hold of a fake ID. The club scene, I had exhausted that by the time I was 17. The college scene, as far as college parties, I was done with that by the time I was 17. Alcohol, drugs, you name it, nothing seemed to help me. I then thought to myself, well, I need to find something to give me peace. I was so distraught. I remember at one point, I actually thought to myself, I'll just kill myself. I never thought about acting on it, but I remember thinking about, man, I'll just kill myself. And actually what's interesting about that, I'll backtrack to that in a moment. As I was just thinking, you know what, I've tried everything. I'll try meditation. Meditation didn't work. I remember meditation, I was trying to meditate and it just sucked me into a dark, deep hole. I remember trying astral projection when you could leave your body. I thought to myself, maybe that's the key. And, you know, I tried all types of mystic studies, if you will, of new age spirituality, trying to study the Kundalini, or whether it's my chi and my energy and how to channel that. You know, how do I manage that through chakras? And I just tried to immerse myself in all of it. And none of that gave me any hope or solace at all. And I can remember at this point, you know, I was done with school. I had dropped out of high school. I only had a few months left to graduate, and it would have been fine. Probably just needed to show up a few times each week because my grades were pretty solid. But I remember just being done with high school, and things just weren't looking good at all. And sitting here and having this thought in my room one night, one afternoon, I just thought, oh, man, I'll just kill myself. Again, I wasn't thinking about it. But what's interesting, thinking about literally doing it, but what's interesting is when I hit rock bottom, I remember thinking to myself, there's got to be some hope. And during this time, somebody knocked on my door and said, hey, Akil, don't do what you're thinking about doing. Now, when I tell you they knocked on my door, they didn't knock on the front door. I lived in kind of the basement, and we had a sliding door. And so they knocked on that door, not my front door. They knocked on that door, which is I was maybe 3.5 feet from that. And they knocked and said, Akil, don't do what you're thinking about doing. And that was it. Didn't say anything else. Didn't say anything else. I knew the voice. I didn't know the guy too well, but he was this guy who loved to play tennis. And if anybody follows tennis, there was a guy who was kind of an iconic figure. He wasn't the best. He was really good, but he wasn't the best. But Andre Agassi, he kind of looked like him. And I remember thinking, I wonder what that's all about. So he invited me. Later, this guy comes by my house and he invites me to church. And I was like, well, church, what is that all about? I was like, how is that going to help me? I was like, I don't need a bunch of rules about what I can and can't do. I'm not down with all that. So I began to friendship with this guy, and he kept inviting me church to church. And I would take him and actually drop him off. And I would tell him I would go, and I'd say, oh man, I'm going to go. And we'd get in the parking lot. And I'm like, oh, I'll be there in a minute. And he'd go, and I would just take off and leave. And he'd find the way back home. And then one day, you know what? I just thought to myself, man, I've tried everything else. I might as well. This is exactly what I thought to myself. I might as well give Jesus a try. And so I maybe have been in the church 5 or 6 times